Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel session titled, What Next America? Moving on after the insurrection and inauguration. This session is one of many events organized by the Department of History and Government for Black History Month at Bowie State University. My name is Dr. Suman Thready, and I'll be moderating the session. If you are a student attending this session for one of your professors, please make sure you're logged in using your full name so that we can provide an attendance list to your professors. You do not need to notify us during this presentation, as the Zoom attendance feature will automatically record your name when you log in. If you are not able to figure out how to put your name in there, that's okay. You can just talk to us at a later time. At this moment, I don't think I'll be able to figure out how to put your name in there because of the ongoing session. So this panel consists of 4 BSU faculty, staff experts in the fields of geography, history, journalism, and politics to discuss the factors and circumstances that led to the January 6th insurrection and its impact on the presidential inauguration. This will be followed by an assessment on how to move forward in a divided America. In the first half of the session, the 4 panelists will answer specific pre-prepared questions on this topic. The second half of the session will allow significant time for a Q&A session for audience members to engage with the panelists, as well as to provide your own commentary. We also ask that you kindly mute your microphones until the second half of our session. So the 4 panelists today are, starting off with Dr. Matthew Crosston, who serves as the Director of Academic Transformation under the Provost at Bowie State University. In addition, he has specialized in international security, intelligence studies, global leadership, and education innovation. He's an acclaimed author and speaker who consults with government, media organizations, and academic institutions on a range of issues covering peace mediation, human rights conflicts, intelligence, and change leadership. He has a BA from Colgate University, a master's from the University of London, a PhD from Brown University, and also completed his postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Toronto. Our next panelist is Dr. Roger A. Davidson Jr., who is an associate professor of history in the Department of History and Government. Dr. Davidson is a native Washingtonian with a passion for the history of the city, as well as the Chesapeake region. He holds a BA in economics from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and received both his master's and doctoral degrees in history from Howard University. Aside from a social history of the United States military and naval services, his areas of interest include the Civil War era, emancipation, and the Cold War. Dr. Davidson has published and presented in the areas of military and naval history, and these also comprise several appearances on National Public Radio, which is NPR, C-SPAN, local news channels, and historical documentaries. Our next panelist is Dr. Karima A. Haynes, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communications. She holds a bachelor's degree from Clark Atlanta University, a master's degree from Northwestern University, and a doctorate in education from Bowie State University. Dr. Haynes has served as coordinator of the print journalism concentration in the Department of Communications since 2007. She's also a former staff writer of the Los Angeles Times, Ebony, and the Providence Journal. Her research interests include cyberbullying, scholastic journalism, and women in leadership. And the last panelist for today will be Dr. Suman Thready, which is myself, who is an assistant professor of geography in the Department of History and Government. He received a bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, a master's degree from the University of North Texas, and a PhD from Kansas State University, all in the field of geography. His interests are in globalization, qualitative studies, and cultural, medical, and tourism geographies. He's also actively involved in leading study abroad programs at BSU, where his most recent trips took students to China, London, and Ghana. So before we start with our questions, I would like to kindly remind all panelists to please keep your responses to about 2 to 3 minutes in length to ensure that we can answer as many questions as possible in the allotted time. And again, the first 25 to 30 minutes, we'll have a Q&A session just between the panelists, and the last 30 minutes will be opened up for our students and audience members to ask any questions either live or via the chat. Okay, so let's go ahead and start the first question, which is for Dr. Crosston. This is a short one. Is there such a thing as Trumpism?
A short one, but maybe not so simple. I'm really pleased to see such a big audience. I'm really proud of everyone for doing that and being motivated. I love these kinds of things, so I'm happy and hope we can continue doing events like this for Bowie, both one day face-to-face again, but in the meantime, certainly still taking advantage of our virtual technologies. As far as, is there such a thing as Trumpism? I somewhat come out right now in the minority in this because I don't believe there is such a thing as Trumpism. What I do believe is that we have former President Trump which is very typical of Trump actually, is attaching his name and his brand to something that already existed, that already was there, already was significant. And then he capitalizes on that for his own agenda, for his own purposes, and rides it for as long as he can continue riding it. In this case, and I'm sure, and we'll, from our other panelists, we'll hear just how long a history this quote unquote Trumpism has in the United States. But for modern stakes, what it really amounts to me is it began in earnest under Obama with the Tea Party movement. And it's a fascinating thing to me within the Tea Party movement, and we saw this over and over and over again during Donald Trump's term in office, is you maybe had an initial real foundational idea behind the movement, the idea of too much taxation, the idea of government is too big, bureaucracy is too unwieldy and not useful. Those are legitimate political concerns, legitimate political complaints. But inside of that Tea Party movement, inside of those legitimate political ideas, was this sort of this sinister negative energy and edge to it as well, that at the very least hinted at, if not overtly directed, sort of racist undertones and prejudicial undertones and discriminatory undertones, isolationism, the idea of division and partisanship. So it was running both things at the same time, and it just depended on who you spoke to within the movement as to which part got emphasized more. That's what I think we're calling Trumpism now, is actually that movement that existed well before Trump. And whether or not we learn to get rid of the name Trumpism, because one, I just hate the term, but get rid of it because it's not accurate. And I think, unfortunately, it communicates the wrong message to people, which is that, well, we voted Trump out of office, so Trumpism is kind of a past tense issue and not something to be dealing with. I think the Tea Party movement, we don't even really talk about Tea Party anymore, but the ideas that were inside of it still clearly exist. They still run powerfully amongst a significant population in America. And that's why I don't think it's going to go away.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Crosston. The next question is for Dr. Davidson. How are the events of January 6th a continuation of previous politically conservative movements that centered feelings of abandonment and disenfranchisement?
Well, I have to agree with Dr. Crosston that, there's no such thing really as Trumpism. In fact, what we think of as Trumpism comes out of a past where you have individuals who want to conserve the status quo. They're afraid of change. They brought into some kind of an idea, whether it was the lost cause idea that still exists after the Civil War, of the slaves that loved their master and the master that loved the slaves, and paternalism, or in a more modern sense, this idea of the American dream, this image of an American dream that is enmeshed in a lot of white chauvinism, so to say. Now, I'm not saying this, and I tell my students, when I talk about white or whiteness, we're not talking about angels or devils. I'm talking about ideas in human beings. So, this idea of this, white picket fence and house and good paying job in the safe suburbs. And, just to conserve that, this momentous promise that those who are different are going to stay away. And then you'll have this dream. Not to prolong it, but it is the past that it's linked to. I mentioned the lost cause, but in the 1920s and 30s, there was 100% Americanism. That was one movement that was very dangerous. It led to the a second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan and the rise of something called the Black Legion, and it supported American white nativism. A lot of people were hurt. In the 1950s and 60s, you had this racialized anti-communism. So anytime you had an American Indian movement or an African-American civil rights movement or anything with labor or Latinos, it had to be something from Moscow and something evil. You had the silent majority of middle white America with that supposedly promoted these traditional American values, and they feared that they were losing this. And under Nixon, he talks about he racializes that. Under Reagan talks about prayer in school and the welfare queen scare. And so these things are linked all the way up to George W. Bush and Willie Horton, the Tea Party movement. And now we have this right-wing populist movement where people feel that there's change coming that's going to deny them that American dream. And just one last thing, they do feel disaffected and unheard. And so they're angry. They feel that government is failing them.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Davidson. I think based on what Dr. Crosston and what Dr. Davidson have said, I'll take the next question, which is, were the sentiments that led to the January 6th insurrection purely an American phenomenon, or are similar sentiments shared across the globe? And this is a perfect question for someone like me as a geographer who looks at political systems around the world. And the sentiments that many people in this country have shared that led to the insurrection aren't sentiments that are uniquely American. Those sentiments are being shared by people all across the world. One could argue that most of this right-wing populism has been more in Europe and parts of Europe, but you can actually find it all across the world. If you look at Europe today, there are a few country leaders that lead their country based on right-wing populism, but there are also a lot of countries that have parties that are involved with the overall government. As many of you know, unlike the US, where we have two major political parties, in many countries around the world, especially in Europe, you have multiple political parties, and they always have to form a unity government to rule the country. So it might not necessarily be just one party, but they might have to find unity among several groups. And right-wing populist groups have become more powerful in the last 10 years or so. I can go off of lists, countries like France, Hungary, Austria, Bulgaria, Netherlands, Denmark, Spain, Switzerland. So you find this primarily in Europe, but you can also find it in places like Argentina and Brazil. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro has been linked to Trump extensively. You can also find it in Asia, places like Philippines and India, where I'm from. We have our Prime Minister in India, who is Narendra Modi. He is part of the BJP party, which is a strong Hindu nationalist party. And 80% of India's population is made up of Hindus. About 15% is made up of Muslims, and another 5% is Christian and a few other religions. But when he came into power and got reelected, he got elected, or his party at least, the Hindu Nationalist Party, got elected overwhelmingly. So there's a sense of, what you see in Western Europe is a little different than what you see in places like Asia, in India, for example. There, it's more religion-based to a large part, whereas it's Hindus versus Muslims. Whereas in Western Europe, it might be more ethnicity-based or race-based and a combination of religion-based. So geography plays an important role in looking at all these places. You can also look at Australia's government, where they have some elements of more right-wing populism today. So it's all over the world. It's not just an American phenomenon. So let me go to the next question, which is for Dr. Haynes. Is there a point at which free speech comes close enough to triggering serious harm that it loses its First Amendment protection?
Yes, thank you so much for allowing me to be on the panel today. I appreciate it. I kind of want to take it just a little different. I know that we have a not politicians, but geographers and historians and political scientists on the panel. But as a journalist, we're kind of looked at as an observer. We're like the fourth estate. And our role is to look at the judiciary, look at the Congress, and look at the executive branch, and to serve as a watchdog over these three other branches of government. So in some ways, we're the observers of what's happening. And our fight is to make sure that we're vigilant, to make sure that free speech is open, available, consistent, and not shut down by the government. So yes, there are times where free speech rights may be censored by the government, either prior to publication or after publication. So an example of prior to publication would be the US versus the Progressive magazine, in which a magazine wanted to publish an article that had the step-by-step instructions on how to develop an H-bomb. The writer of the magazine article sent it to the Department of Energy to make sure that it was factually accurate. And when they saw that article, essentially they hit the roof and said, you cannot publish this article. You cannot put together an article that shows how people can build an H-bomb. It's a risk to public safety. There was a argument over that, of course, and the Progressive magazine actually won that case because they said the information was out there all along. It was not censored by the government in any way. It was not protected by the government in any way. We just put all the pieces together. So that's an example of publication or censorship, attempt at censorship prior to publication. The most famous example of censorship after publication would be the Pentagon Papers, in which a researcher was doing research for the Vietnam War and discovered, of course, that the United States wasn't being as forthcoming as it should have been, saying that the war was going well when the war actually was not going well. Those papers were leaked to the Washington Post and to the New York Times first, and then the Washington Post. And once it was, those first stories were published, the government tried to step in and censor those First Amendment rights to publish. So the kind of long and short of the answer is that, yes, there are times when the government will step in and attempt to censor journalistic product, but it has to reach a very, very, very high threshold. The point that kind of leads us to our January 6th situation is the speech that former President Trump gave before the insurrection, and whether or not those words that he used, and we're going to fight, you're going to have to fight like hell, or we won't have a country, whether or not those words actually incited the riot. And that there actually is a standard, that test where words, free speech words, he's a president, free speech, walks right up to the line where it's most likely to cause an insurrection or violence. So we've already had the political process where we've gone through the impeachment hearings, and through the political process, obviously, he was charged in the House and acquitted in the Senate. That's the political process, but we'll still have the criminal process. All of the investigation that's going on with the FBI, all these hearings that are going on in Congress now, that he may be held accountable where he crossed the line, his free speech crossed the line into inciting a riot. That's what we're trying to determine now. And then there's also going to be the civil process in which these police officers who lost their lives or people who were injured in that riot may be bringing civil lawsuits against the president. So it's not just in one arena. It's not like his free speech, he got away with it. I mean, there are like two other arenas where he's going to be held accountable. So yes, in the short, yes, there are times when free speech can be censored, but it's a very, very, very high bar.
Right. Okay, thank you, Dr. Haynes. So the next question is for Dr. Davidson. In what ways did white supremacy play a part in the tensions that led to the January 6th insurrection?
Well, it plays a large part, actually, even though there were non-whites there. So if you take a look at some of the language, and that will be linked to some of the ideas of white supremacy. The language, in fact, I mean, of course, there were uses of the N-words, racial slurs, but let's just see how, the way that these insurrectionists identified. They called themselves true Americans, or even harking back to 100% Americans of the 1920s. They called themselves patriots. And in looking at their Americanness, the way they viewed their Americanness was through a lens of whiteness. Even if you look at the Proud Boys, whose leader is an Afro Latino, they talk about white chauvinism, and many of that is linked directly to white supremacy. So yes, it played a major part. Again, in their American landscape is filled with this idea of these safe white suburbs. Many of you are too young to even know some of the TV shows from the 50s, like Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver, where you have these idealized homes. There's no strife, mom and dad, or everybody's cool, and everybody gets what they need, their little life lessons taught. But you don't see any people of color. You don't see anything. Even though in America, there are people of color who are middle class and upper class and live in safe suburbs and safe environments. But they juxtapose this idea of a clean living space, of what they think of as American Christianity and good paying jobs against what they see as the other, the non-white, the non-Christian, the non-traditional, and the non-Anglo interloper who seems to be gnawing away at your America. And all these people really want are inclusion and equity. They've always been here. Therefore, when there are economic downturns and other issues like we've been having, you have propagandists and others who are telling these people, those who are seeming disaffected, that the problems are being caused, and this is, you can go back in the past and see this, by socialist and communist allies of the other. The propagandists feed the fears of ordinary Americans with visions of terrifying hordes of Muslims, South American caravans coming towards the border, BLM activists in the street, and their Antifa allies invading your nice, clean suburbs, your political, social, and living spaces. These people, as our former president said, are rapists, they are criminals, and some are good people. And now we have Congress people who are stoking the fires with fears of Sharia law. And one of the reasons this is linked to that, the former president became their spokesperson. He told them what they wanted to hear. And in as much, he became their warrior savior, whose election was then stolen by socialists in the colored horde. So yes, it is connected.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Davidson. The next question is for Dr. Haynes, just to follow up on the first question regarding free speech. So did former President Trump lose his free speech rights under the First Amendment when Twitter flagged his tweets containing disinformation and later suspended his account?
No, he did not lose his free speech right. He's the president of the United States. He's the leader of the free world. All he had to do was walk from the residence in the White House downstairs to the press office, and he could have had any statement put out around the world. He could have put together he could have a speech from the Oval Office, from any room within the White House. He could have had a prime time speech on television. He even put out his own videos. So no, his free speech rights were not trampled on, weren't trampled on at all. These social media platforms are private companies, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, all of them, they're private companies, and they have their own policies and their regulations for users. When you sign up for an account and you click, I agree, after reading that long statement that no one ever reads and just clicks, I agree, you're saying that you agree to their policies. And Twitter looked at his account and said, okay, you're spreading disinformation and misinformation just being wrong information, but disinformation meaning you are deliberately meant to deceive your audience by saying over and over again that the election was fraudulent when there was no evidence to support that. And so it was disinformation. He violated their user contract, and he was flagged and his account was suspended. Facebook followed suit, and of course Facebook owns Instagram, so we had the same situation. And also Parler, which is another app, they sold their app in the Google store, the Android store, and the Apple store, and all three of them shut down the sale of Parler, so you couldn't download their app. So Parler just has to find another distribution channel, but their free speech rights weren't weren't compromised in any way at all. No. So he's the leader of the free world. He has access. No.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Haynes. I just wanted to say I received a question from a student, and to all our audience members, we have a few more minutes where we have a couple of questions for the panelists, and after that, we'll quickly jump into any questions from our audience. We'll have a good 25 to 30 minutes, so I promise that we'll get to every single question this afternoon. So the next question is for Dr. Crosston. What role does post-truth play in these modern political dilemmas?
I think that actually has a very big role. And for those who aren't aware of what that term has come to mean in modern politics, post-truth, I think I find more and more people thinking it means, well, we just like lies. And it, to a certain extent, that's actually true. Because there are tons and tons of psychological studies that have proven that the way our mind tends to work, and it seems especially so in the modern political day, is that we have evolved to a point where we seem to like less and less challenging information. We don't like our ideas being contested. We don't like people trying to come with counter arguments or us trying to figure out alternative perspectives that don't match up with the preconceived ideas we already have. And if anything, the phenomenon of social media and how we act on social media has almost taken post-truth and just exponentially increased its intensity. So what we're finding our people are basically surrounding themselves with just like-minded people, sources, whether they're legitimate sources or fake sources, doesn't seem to matter. What matters is, do these sources confirm what I already believe in? Because I don't want to be troubled by this pesky stuff that's sort of, ooh, you're challenging what I have to say. Ooh, you don't like what I have to say and your ideas sound better than mine. No. I don't want to deal with that. I'd rather just live in my own little echo chamber, my own little bubble, surrounded by people who think like me, and I'll enjoy my life that way. Like I said, we've seen studies where this is actually how society seems to be socially organizing itself now. And that obviously has really huge repercussions in terms of the quality of American politics. And I've mentioned before, and I'll sort of end on this brief note, is the fact that while we're always quick to complain about, the two-party system stinks, I don't like either party, we need a third party, this is awful. One of the great privileges of a two-party system was always that it was meant to be, to win on big national elections, you need to come back into the center, which is by default more moderate, more calm, more rational. And most of our electoral history has been pushed in that direction for all time. But now, with a combination of social media, post-truth, and fake sources, we're beginning to at least be a little concerned that maybe you don't need to be in the center to win even big elections. Did Trump prove that you don't have to be a calm, moderate, sane, rational presence on the political spectrum to win? You can be as far out there on either side as you want to be, as long as you muster your troops enough to outvote any moderate side. And that's a real concern. For me, that's a really, really deeply concerning thing, much more so than just the idea of, if we don't get a third party soon, I'm just quitting politics. Like, I can sympathize with that sentiment, but much more damaging to me is the idea that just regular people don't want to challenge themselves, don't want to think about alternative information, don't want to engage in debates and discussions, just want to surround themselves with like-minded people. Whether it's left or right, moderate or conservative or liberal, doesn't matter. That type of stagnation will only be bad for the political world in our country.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Crosston. So I'll take the next question. So who attacked the Capitol, and what is the geography of the insurrectionists? So I think by now it's clear in terms of who attacked the Capitol, people in terms of their beliefs, but what exactly is their geography? Like, where do they come from? Do they come from particular states? Do they come from all states? There hasn't been a wholesale analysis of this concept yet. I've seen various reports in terms of where people are coming from, but people can have this nationalist populism beliefs no matter what state they live in. You might have certain states where you find more people with similar sentiments. Say, for example, I think Montana and Idaho come up quite frequently. So you might have more people there believing these sentiments, but that does not mean we can't find people with similar sentiments from any state within the US. In fact, I think the last article that I read talked about approximately either 250 or 300 people. Charges were filed against about 250 or 300 people, insurrectionists. And they looked at where most of these people came from. And they're from all over the US. Certain states stick out a little more than the other, but we're only talking about 250 to 300 people. Where are the remaining people that took part in the insurrection? There were several hundred, if not several thousands, possibly. So until all that data comes out, we might not know. But this can tie into geography because many people who share or sympathize with the insurrectionists, one could argue at least a larger proportion of them might come from rural America or maybe certain states, and maybe not so much from, let's say, the East Coast or some of the urban areas, because urban areas tend to be much more diverse in terms of population, race, ethnicity. And this, again, could be applied globally. When you look at Brexit, which is England or the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, about 52% of the United Kingdom, I think in 2016 or so, voted to no longer be part of the European Union. And if you look at the maps breaking down where most of these people voted, you would see that most urban areas, cities around London, Manchester, some of the major urban areas voted to be part of the European Union, which, quote unquote, is more of a globalist area, right? Where they look at connections with countries all around the world, trade with all around the world, whereas people that lived away from the city voted to be part of Brexit. They did not want to be part of the European Union any longer. So even in the US, you could probably break it down to sort of like an urban and moving out. That's where people have their beliefs. But I would really, every Friday in my classes, I post a map linking different concepts, just showing that on a map. I think I just call them Friday Facts, and my students can relate to that. So I would really like to see, once they get more data on where a lot of these people came from, them being plotted on the US map to see where many of them came. But that does not mean, those similar sentiments aren't shared, let's say in Baltimore or in Maryland or in Massachusetts. So it can be anywhere from within the country, but there tends to be that rural-urban split between the belief systems. So it is 3:34, so we've gone about a half hour. And as you can see, each of us talking for 2 to 3 minutes, it goes by so quickly. I know we still have several questions. I am getting some questions in the chat from YouTube that our moderator is also posting on here. So let me go to this question first, and then I can open it up to students. Students, you can type your question in the chat, or even better, you can actually unmute yourself and ask us a question. So let me just get through this question very quickly. And this can apply to any one of the panelists. So how does one reconcile people of color supporting white supremacy, like the leader of the Proud Boys, And I think Dr. Davidson, you brought that up. So maybe you can take a stab at this one first.
Well, I don't know about reconciling, but the reason why you find this, again, you have people who aren't white who view the American dream through this idea of whiteness and through white chauvinism. So you can say they sort of drank the Kool-Aid. Some people may call it assimilation. It's sort of, but that's why you have that. And they feel that the bad actors out there are the ones that are causing the problems. You find this in all so-called racial groups and ethnic groups, where you have those who are striving to obtain the middle-class dream, fearing those who would somehow bring shame or upon the group as a whole, or may ruin it for everybody. So that's why you have that.
I just wanted to add something. If I could just add, just to follow on to Roger, there was an article in the Washington Post, I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was an op-ed from a professor at I believe it was New York University, and it was called Multicultural Whiteness.
Yeah.
And that was the idea where people will kind of adopt whiteness to be, this is the premier example of how to be American, and I will adopt that to be a part of the mainstream. And I think that's exactly what Dr. Davidson is talking about.
Dr. Crosston?
I still have trouble. I still honestly have trouble with it in the sense of, because I think there's a distinction, a legitimate distinction made between those who are, whether we're taking the classic term of assimilation or the idea that you're buying into the American dream, or you're even discounting for yourself ethnicity or race as a significant identity feature, and you want to focus on other features for your identity as a priority, versus members of the community of color actually espousing racial philosophies that are anti their own color. Like that to me is, there's a psychological break there that needs to be sort of investigated and informed better to understand it. Because on the one hand, I can at least see someone's logic. I may not agree with it personally, but I can see someone's logic talking about, I have multiple things that I identify with. I believe in the nationalistic American dream above all else. Fine. I don't think it's the strongest argument, but I can at least grant some people may mean that sincerely, versus someone like a person of color being the leader of the Proud Boys, or like we've seen comedians talk about the Grand Wizard of the KKK being an African American one day. And I was like, I wouldn't put it past it, but it's like there's something not logical about it.
Well, the one logical aspect, and see, I really think the guy that's in charge of the Proud Boys, he's a little different in that I think he's a con man. And so he has them con. But there are those in groups, and there are not many of them, that's why you see so few, who totally, they will espouse racist ideas. And you can encounter them. They generally don't say things publicly, or it's not overt. And I'm not going to use some of the terminology. I mean, some of the people in my class have heard it. They've heard members of their family. There's a character, what's the name of the cartoon? But the character's called Uncle Ruckus. And anything that's Black, Uncle Ruckus hates. So it's that sort of thing. And sometimes that stuff comes from feelings of shame. They're so ashamed of themselves, a bit of self-hatred, that they just go overboard. And they identify anything, they identify with, they try to attack anything they think that is negative with regard to whatever their ethnic group or racial group is.
Okay, thank you, colleagues, and thank you for that question, which actually came from YouTube. Now, any of our audience members, our students, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself, you can raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask the question to a specific panelist or the panel as a group. Or even if you have some comments or experiences that you want to share, this is a free speech zone, so please feel free. I'm sure if I said 50 points extra credit to the next student who asks a question, we'll ask one right away, but I'm not going to.
Well, I'd like to ask a question if possible, just to get things.
Absolutely.
Dr. Crosston, I love the discussion on post-truth. And I was wondering, how is it that we could sort of combat the issues associated with post-truth? Not just the misinformation, but people imbibing the disinformation and unwilling to, consider anything else.
Yeah, I promise that's an awesome question that I did not plant on Dr. Davidson. Is that because I've given talks and written about this in the past, where it's sometimes people get angry with me because ultimately what I really believe the key solution is, ironically, revolves around what we do. And it's sort of the holy mission of higher education in general, and always has been, which is these principles of analytical thought and critical reasoning and discernment, right? There's an old-fashioned word that people sort of forgotten about, is Can you discern information, not just consume it? And these are just classic old school intellectual terms, like why we go to college, why we study in the first place, why we wish to become subject matter experts or specialists in anything, is the idea that we can critically reason, we can analytically think, we can take on counter arguments and challenge those back to us, that we embrace debate and discussion. It's amazing to me that when you talk to people today about post-truth, they feel like we have to create some kind of new wheel to deal with the problem. And I just feel very, very strongly that going back to some of the old wheels, but maybe being innovative in how we try to encourage it is really, really important, because we've somehow, somewhere along the way, it became less important to be around people who think differently from us, to hear ideas and thoughts that don't match and mesh with our ideas and thoughts. People started just having a distaste for that, or sort of a risk averse for discussion. It's like, I don't want to be involved. No, because it just becomes a fight. And the classic line I've used before in the past, and I'll wrap up, I'm sorry, I'm blabbing a bit, is that I hate the transformation that's happened with the phrase, we'll have to agree to disagree. Because in the past, I swear, I believe this, at least I believe this, that in the past, that used to mean, when you did that, is that was the consequence of, we've already been debating and discussing something at length, and
Right.
haven't come to an agreement or a consensus or a compromise, so we will have to agree to disagree. But now when you look on, especially in social media or on Facebook or something, what you'll see over and over again are people will say, we're going to agree to disagree, before they even engaged anybody, because they get a sense of what people believe, and like, oh, I'm not going to talk to you. You don't agree with me, so we'll just have to agree to disagree, because you're not going to change my mind and I'm not going to change your mind. So let's just skip the conversation. And that to me is devastating, is because it's literally, that's where some of the more interesting conversations are going to be, with the people that know how to talk to you civilly and respectfully, but maybe don't agree with you or see eye to eye with you.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Haynes.
I want to add on something just quickly that Dr. Crosston said that might, sadly, the previous administration did a great job of branding the phrase fake news. The press is the enemy of the state, alternative facts. The only thing that we have in the US that really separates us from these communist countries, socialist countries, is a free press, someone on the outside who can examine these three branches of government. And when the executive branch of the government says that the press is the enemy, where else are you going to turn? You're going to believe the executive office, and you're not going to pursue like those ideas that are alternative to the alternative facts and fake news, etc. And so as a journalist, that is my job, to continue to dig for the truth and present it even when it's inconvenient.
So I have two more questions here, one from YouTube and one from a student who's at work who can't ask out loud, but he or she has typed it in here. So I think the first question, Dr. Haynes, you could answer this. Where is the question? Let's see. What role does the media play in this realm of post-truth?
Exactly. I mean, our job is to uncover the truth. I mean, to look at, you have to tell the whole truth, the precise truth, the complete truth. It can't be a partial truth. It can't be a shaded truth, but it has to be the complete and precise truth. And if you're not telling that, then you really need to get out of the business.
If I could jump real quick, there's also an aspect to this that is sort of the interplay between the consumers of media and the media itself, because I know media is often very quick to say we act more like the mirror, we give what people want, and we'd love to put a 90-minute intensive in-depth news show on at 8 p.m. every night, but the fact is 3 people would watch it and all our advertisers would quit, and then we'll be out of business. So, but that's actually more critique, I think, of the people consuming the news. And we've shifted. We obviously have shifted in this great sort of instant media age of, we like personalities, we like hot takes, we like having an opinion, even if they're not grounded very well in facts or distorted by political agendas. If we could find ways, to what Dr. Davidson was mentioning before, if we could find ways to get the people once again interested in information for the sake of knowledge and knowing things better, rather than just what's the most entertaining way for me to get my news. That's been a real downfall, I think, for some people.
And I think that's why, as educators, whether we're in the K through 12 system or higher ed, teaching our students that critical analysis, critical thinking skills is so important. I'm from India originally, and we use WhatsApp for text messaging, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. And India had a huge problem with all kinds of fake messages circulating on WhatsApp. And it's the same thing with, fake messages, untruths just circulating on Facebook and what have you. So there is so much information out there that can be very detrimental to society. But I think teaching our next generation how to critically analyze and think about about the information that we see outside is so crucial. And that's why educators, I think, play a very important role in a better future in terms of our consumption of the appropriate information. Let me go to the question from a student who is at work. The student says, how do we get people to understand that Trump wanted nothing but destruction? So that could depend on how you feel about Trump and various, various philosophies you might have. So how do you get people to understand that Trump wanted nothing but destruction? If that is true.
All right, I'm going to take it on.
Please do. That's a hard one.
I guess I'll slightly push back on it, only in the simple sense that there's obviously there's legitimate competing definitions about what one person is calling destruction. He has obviously groups favorable to him that would call it pushback against the deep state or undermining things that make America weak. They have this political dialogue amongst themselves that justify to them what they're doing, even if others on the other side of the spectrum look at it as undoing fundamental principles and values that are important to global order and to global governance and an international community. Issues of like climate change. I talked forever on the idea of Trump. I always see, and I think the panelists agree with me on this, like Trump is an opportunist, always has been his entire life an opportunist. And I don't think he necessarily went into the presidency exactly the same way he came out. I think he transformed during the presidency itself and he didn't drink his own Kool-Aid. I think he drank the Kool-Aid of the most radical people who supported him. And he thought, these are the people who are with me, do or die. So I'm going to go for what they believe in. And they believe in, I'm president so that I can dismantle the government. I'm president so that I can destroy all the agencies and the institutions of power. And he came to act as if that's really what his mission was. So we had this fundamentally crazy process of, I'll put in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency a guy who literally always sought to destroy the environment in his career. Or I'll put in charge of the energy, Department of the Energy, someone who fundamentally misused and was completely backwards on ideas of fossil fuels and nuclear power and natural gas. And part of it was not just he didn't know how to pick people, it was he actually felt, I'm put here to undo all these institutions. And that, I think, in some ways can be very much seen as destruction, but it looked to them on that side as part of the holy mission.
Okay, so I have two more questions in the chat. So let's see. It's a general question to the panel. How do we stop another politician from gaining the same leverage that Trump did during his administration? Or how would we stop fanaticism of the next Trump if one were to turn up? I just read something yesterday, I think, where Senator Mitt Romney said if President Trump wants to run again in 2024, more than likely, he'll be the Republican nominee. And you can see sort of the majority of Republicans are still sticking with Trump right now. There are a few people who are trying to separate themselves, but they are having a very hard time, and people are going after them hard. So maybe Dr. Davidson can try this question, and then Dr. Haynes.
I'll give it a try. I mean, there's not much I think you can do but to try to go after those post-truths that Dr. Haynes and Dr. Crosston have been talking about, to try to dispel some of the disinformation, which is going to be very difficult if people aren't going to accept anything from you, but also to try to address the fears. One thing we need to do is to, we can't be divided like this unless, and not acknowledge that there are a group of people who in their minds have legitimate fears and concerns, and that we have to find a way to talk to them, to deal with them, not deal with them, that's not a good way, but to talk to them, to have discourse, in hopes that we can at least plant a seed. No, no one's trying to take your guns. Back in the day, during the election of 1800, they thought that there were people that thought that Jefferson was going to take the Bibles. So we have to find some way to reach out to our fellow Americans.
I would say that as journalists, we have to be vigilant. Vigilance is imperative. I look back to 2016, and journalists just looked at the Republican candidates and they just thought Donald Trump was a joke and that he wasn't going to go anywhere and that he was going to be dead in the water. And, let's just kind of humor him and go along with him and until he won the nomination. And then journalists were still kind of sitting back going like, okay, well, he's going to pivot. Once he's in office now, we know that those were kind of like his shtick when he was on the campaign trail. And once he gets into office, he's going to pivot and begin to govern. And I think that we just have to have more vigilance going into, 2024, say 2022, just these congressional races, and then going into 2024 to really do due diligence on all of the candidates, both on the Democratic side, on the Republican side, independent, and also to follow up on what Dr. Davidson said, to find a way to talk to people. People feel that the media are elite. They're only interested in New York and California and fly over country. Like, we don't care. We only stop into Iowa and New Hampshire during the election cycles. But in between that time, journalists really have to hear the voices of people from across the country. So it's not this big shock when we get to the presidential campaign.
Yeah, we talk about, nationalism, in our case, more of an America first thinking. It's not necessarily just on the Republican side. Even someone like Bernie Sanders, who's extremely left, has some views where he says, we should focus on American workers first, then have this more of a globalized outlook. So there are some basic root issues that affect people, whether that might be losing a job, right? Whatever it might be, but they get this feeling that it's this globalized society that's affecting them in a negative way. And if there is a way to possibly address some of these issues, that would require a lot of retraining of jobs, because the jobs of yesterday will no longer exist in the future. So you have to make sure some of these people are trained for new jobs of the future. So if they find security in their lives in terms of their economics, right, they might not necessarily go down that rabbit hole. So there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed when we talk about this question. So there is one more question.
Doctor, real quick,
go ahead.
You touch on the globalism, and it's just a weird term for me as a historian. This country's been global from the time it was founded. And I think, in going with what Dr. Crosston was saying, from K through 12 and beyond, if we're not teaching, if we're not giving, and if I use liberal education, people are going to talk about left-leaning, a broad-based education, something beyond vocational, then people won't understand what communism is, what socialism is, or truly what globalism is. As a capitalist country, we have to be global. But anyway, that's how they protect their jobs, by the way.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Davidson. So let me go to the next question. Again, students, audience members, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and let your voice be heard. The next question says, there's talk going around about MAGA Land being built and people departing from America. What would be the repercussions if that were to happen? Quite honestly, I have not heard of that, but I'm sure there is talk about that.
I mean, we've already seen that happen in history already. I mean, with Marcus Garvey, the Back to Africa movement, where African Americans left and moved to Africa, Liberia, and set up their own, their own nation. And I know Dr. Davidson could really speak to that. But so it's not something that's completely unheard of. You heard Malcolm X. Okay, we're just going to have like Black nationalism, create our own all-Black state. It's not something that's unusual. Whether or not this will actually come to fruition, doubtful, in my opinion, but I'll hand it over to the expert, Dr. Davidson.
Well, what I can say is I've heard it, and I think it's somewhat, people saying those who think they can establish a MAGA land, that's ridiculous. There's no land out there. There's not a country that's going to let a group of Americans just come in. And the last time that it happened and caught attention in the news, it was Jim Jones. He was serving a poison Kool-Aid. I don't want to make a connection between him and Trump, but they go to Guyana, they set up this utopian village under a man who is a rabid narcissist and thinks he's somewhat the second coming of Christ. So they can try that, but I don't know. I've heard that they're trying to do something in Europe. Those nations aren't going to let you just set up an independent state. But that's a security threat. And especially since you're American. That's very much, I love America, I'm a patriot. However, we're known to go places and become very paternalistic in a way. We want to tell everybody else how to live.
I just wish Trump's children would stop spreading these rumors around. This is a non-issue. I mean,
it's ridiculous.
I get the complaint. I get where it comes from in that sense of, but there's a fundamental contradiction that they themselves, people who, if anyone says this seriously, they're fundamentally not noticing the contradiction in the sense of they supposedly were the Patriot Party, the people who loved America the most, and now even if you don't like your president and vice president at the moment, are you telling me for real you want to completely abandon the country and everything about it you supposedly loved? It's a non-starter.
It is. And just like the modern secessionist movement. Look at what Texas hasn't actually seceded, but they pulled themselves off the grid. You can see what would happen with that. In those states, you cannot secede. We answered that already.
So I'll make one quick comment and then we'll go to the last question because it's almost 4 o'clock. I would say, where would these people go? I mean, 50, 100, 150, 200 years ago, it was possible to travel, set up your own country, but now political boundaries are pretty much set in stone, no matter where you go. So if people do want to move somewhere, it would have to be done legally for the most part, documented, and it cannot be in great numbers. So geography and politics itself will stop a concept like that from actually being truly taking place. So let me go to the very last question. I think we've received amazing questions so far from our students. So I commend you guys for that. And this is a very appropriate question. How are we as millennials supposed to sustain ourselves when there are people in the government that continue to break us down and stop us from receiving healthcare or building enough income for a house, etc.? That's a loaded question, and there are so many mini questions within that large question, but it is 4 o'clock, so if we can try to wrap this up in the next few minutes, that would be greatly appreciated.
I'll take a small shot real quick because it reminds me of something that used to be really important to me. It's probably now dating myself when I say there was a quote that Bill Clinton used to say all the time in his first term as president, which was about the new economy. And I always used to say that the one thing he never bothered to stop and explain is that the new economy was meant to be something to inspire hope and everything else, but it was actually really a criticism about the fact that things in America were changing in terms of job opportunities, in terms of the type of education you need to pursue. And that and he was basically saying, if you don't strategically position yourself in the right way as a millennial, as a young person growing up, so you're choosing the right type of educational program, the right type of educational institution, you're strategically positioning yourself to get ready for the new types of jobs and the new types of opportunity, and don't get stuck in old thinking, you'll get left behind, is literally what he's saying, is because he could see the shift coming where all these old style jobs are going to be shipped overseas for cheaper labor. and cheaper products. And to a certain extent, even though that was nearly 30 years ago, we still live in this age of having to tell students, and we don't tell them enough, you need to be very strategic. You need to be very planned in your choices in terms of where you go to school, what are you going to study, where is it supposed to lead you to, what path are you trying to get to? It's not just the random, why am I in college? Well, I graduated from high school, so I went to college. That's just what we do in America. I haven't thought about it much more than that. We have to push more strategic thinking.
You know, I agree with you on that, but I'm a dreamer as well. And some people will totally dismiss it. They're like, this guy's on cloud nine somewhere. I think at this point, millennials, if they can get themselves together, and the generation beneath them should try to shift things economically. You as consumers can shift by demanding certain things. So if certain colleges cost too much, then go ahead and get a cheaper school. Everybody start going to cheaper schools, and then run for office. Change politically. But anyway, change things politically. So
Stay woke, stay active, stay hopeful.
Okay. I think with those wise words, I think we can wrap up our session for today. I wanted to thank the panelists, Dr. Crosston, Dr. Haynes, and Dr. Davidson, and myself, Dr. Reddy. I think we worked hard on putting this presentation together. I think we have about 35 participants. So we want to thank all our students and audience members for participating, attending our session, most importantly, and asking very good questions. If you have any questions, you can send an email to me at sreddy@bowiestate.edu, and I can have the appropriate panelists respond back to you. And so that's pretty much it. So hoping for a brighter and more positive future, especially with COVID and a lot of things that are happening right now. I wish you guys all the very best and have a fantastic day, guys.
Thank you, guys.
thank you.
You.